Thank you for the invitation to talk, and I'm presenting you with perhaps the oddest title of the day, Epistemology, Agnotology and Systems Thinking Practice. So first things first, a confession, or at least a clarification. I'm not an expert in systems thinking. I'm relatively new to systems thinking. I'm coming into systems thinking from a very unusual direction. So I spent the last few years making a gradual transition into consultancy work, but I have a former life in academia. I was an academic philosopher and an educational theorist working in an education department, and my specialty was in, oh sorry, it's got a bit mad, there we go. My specialty was in epistemology. So epistemology is just theory of knowledge, and one subsection of it is social epistemology, which is a theory of group knowledge. So knowledge belonging to groups, knowledge passing between groups, consensus within groups, all of that sort of thing. There's a newest offshoot of that called agnotology, which is theory of ignorance, so as in agnostic. So it's great. There's a book on it. It's brilliant. And it's specifically the cultural production of ignorance. So it's not ignorance in the sense of stuff we could not know. It's things that we are ignorant of as a result of cultural choices. So the classic example would be censorship, for example. So none of the concepts I'm introducing are from writers who would call themselves systems thinkers. And in fact, most of them probably don't know the term. But it seems to me that social epistemologists and systems thinkers seem to be cousins who have never met. Social epistemologists and agnotologists are concerned with complex knowledge systems and developing new ways of thinking about those systems and how they might be optimized.
So you could say the agnotologists are ignorant of systems thinking.
Oh yes. Well, they're brand new anyway, so you know, they don't know where they are, which is a whole fascinating thing. But what they tend to focus on, and it will be reflected in many of the examples I use, is academic communities and knowledge flow between specialisms in research communities. They don't tend to use examples or explore the world outside of academia for this, or the corporate world for this. So what I'm hoping is that I can facilitate a knowledge exchange here. It's a bit meta at that point. So I'm hoping to learn from you as I do this. My intention is to introduce some key concepts from epistemology which I think might be useful to you, and find out whether they are. So which is a high-risk strategy, but I'm hoping it will at least be interesting, even if completely irrelevant. So, I hope it's not completely irrelevant. What we're going to do, we're going to start with defining knowledge. Sounds like a big ask. What I actually mean by that is that there is a framework traditionally used in philosophy to think about standards of knowledge, and so we're going to be looking at that and using that a little bit. We're going to talk about epistemic standards and why they differ between subjects, between individuals, between cultures. We're going to talk about the specific problem of gaining knowledge from other groups of which you are not a part, and we're going to talk a little bit about why you might choose ignorance, and including some good reasons for choosing ignorance. There is that. So this is your triangle. I don't know if any of you have seen or are familiar with this before. The tripartite, three-part definition of knowledge. This frames knowledge as composing of three different elements: justification, truth, and belief. So you know something if and only if you have a justified true belief that it's the case. If you're missing any one of these elements, then you're falling short of knowledge. So one element that you might be missing is justification. This is where you have a true belief out of sheer luck. So you don't have any reasonable justification for it at all, but you lucked out. So for example, attempting to put this in a corporate context but being very broad strokes about it, suppose it's your responsibility to hire a new finance team, and you decide to hire 15 people, and it turns out that that is about right. But you hired 15 people because there were 15 people on the team 20 years ago when you started, and you've done no reasonable assessment of what the company now needs. You lucked out. In this circumstance, you obviously don't have sufficient justification. Anyone would expect you to have better reasons for the decision than that. So the idea is that you have messed up in this situation. You've messed up because the standards you held yourself to are too low, and if you don't step them up next time, you won't be so lucky. The takeaway from that is you should be asking yourself whether your standards of justification are appropriate, not just whether you were right. So that's one element you can be missing, which means you fall short of knowledge. Another could be that you have a justified belief, which turns out not to be true. This is where, your justification was perfectly reasonable, but your belief still turns out to be false because something unpredictable happened, or because some evidence was kept from you, or some reason that you were not to blame for. But nonetheless, we think of this as falling short of knowledge because it's not true. You can't know something that's not true.
This is quite a trump.
I mean, that would require him to be justified, so I don't know.
I put the timer on when the first T word would be.
Well,
32 seconds.
yeah. But okay. So I've got an example to explore here, which just introduces the complexity around the word justified. Here's a straightforward example. First, you have a colleague, John. He sends you an invitation to join him in a client meeting on Friday. It's Monday. You accept the invitation. Then the client has some scheduling issues, needs to move the meeting. John reschedules the meeting for a day earlier on Thursday, but forgets to tell you. You are entirely justified in believing that it's on Friday. You missed the meeting on Thursday. Clearly, that's not on you, right? But the reason that example is so straightforward, and the reason is that there is no reasonable expectation that you should have known. So this is the idea with justification, should you have known. There are other circumstances in which arguably you should have known. So suppose that John gets this news, he sends you an email on Tuesday saying, oh, actually the meeting's moved to Thursday, it's not on Friday, it's on Thursday. You don't check your emails often enough. Then you don't show up to the meeting on Thursday. Well, in that case, you are to some degree responsible for your false belief because you neglected to maintain the communication that would have been necessary for you to change your belief when the circumstances changed. You still have some justification, you're going by what you last heard, but it's far less strong a justification than it would be had you checked your emails. So in that case, you could have an argument with John, well, was I justified, was I not? You'd probably lose it. What we have there is the idea that justification takes effort. What I've just described is a very minimum level of effort of checking your email. But what counts as an appropriate level of effort, or an appropriate degree of effort, is debatable and contextual. And it's necessary for people to have an alignment on that. So let's change it slightly more. In this scenario, John sends you that cancellation email, but instead he sends it at 8 PM on a Friday for a meeting which is now going to happen at 9 AM on a Monday. You don't check your emails over the weekend. John does. You've got a misalignment as to what an appropriate degree of justification is for I still know that this meeting is on time. And you need to have a conversation to figure out where the boundaries are and what is expected of you. So sometimes we'll put in appropriate effort to justify our beliefs and we'll still get it wrong because we're fallible. This happens. But also it's important to ensure that our standards of justification are aligned with the people we're working with, and we're on the same page about that.
Is justified in that sense really evidence?
We're not talking about morally justified, or I think there's definitely a sense in which you are morally justified in not checking your emails over the weekend. But yeah, specifically we mean epistemically justified.
So Lisa, if you go back to the, because I didn't know you were going to do this.
Sorry, yeah.
If you go back to the mosaic stuff that I talked about, and I would argue that the belief that it happens in the conventional way is a belief. It's not justified and it's not true. Is that the right rendition of your model? The evidence is it doesn't work.
Yeah.
There you go, it's not true, but you've still got the belief hanging on.
Yes, that's exactly it. Okay. So essentially you have a responsibility to align your belief, or your degree of belief, your degree of certainty, which is sort of what we'll get to the evidence that you have. But I think
for your meeting example on belief. Lots of people move meetings forward by an hour. And some people forward is other people backwards, but they both believe they're right.
Well, that's a fascinating one, actually. It's sort of, an alignment on the meaning of a word in language, very important, and that's a very unfortunate one to be as confusing as it is. Here's a third one. This might be familiar. So this is a situation where you have sufficient justification to believe a particular claim, and the claim is in fact true, but you refuse to believe it anyway. It's somewhat contentious as a way to frame this, because arguably you believe it at some level if you recognise that you have sufficient justification to do so. But when you're disinclined to believe something, you may find that your standards of justification start creeping up and up and up beyond what you would demand for a belief that you were more neutral about. So you get to avoid believing the thing you don't want to believe. One example, maybe you're working for a new startup that runs on sheer optimism, and there are gradually accumulating red flags that this startup is going to fail. Had you observed these red flags happening at another startup that you didn't work for, then you would already have concluded it was going to fail. But you haven't concluded that this one is going to fail, because you are so emotionally attached to its success that what you would normally consider sufficient justification, you refuse to count as sufficient justification. You're saying, oh, well, it's not really that bad because, and the goalposts keep moving. So this is obviously something you might experience with clients when you're bringing unwelcome news. Like they would be less convinced than they ought to be, given what they would, in another circumstance, say to be sufficient reason. So knowing and articulating what your standards of justification are, in what circumstances will we believe that this is the case and act on it, is not only necessary to ensure that you meet those standards before you believe the conclusions, but also to help ensure that once those standards have been met, you accept the conclusion as true, even if it's unpleasant. So this is ancient. This is ancient Greek sort of tripartite definition of knowledge, but that's the sort of, so to summarise that element, knowledge can be framed as justified true belief. This framing puts forward this idea that belief ought to be proportionate to justification. The social complexity is we have to decide what counts as appropriate justification, and we're usually not doing that by ourselves. We're not deciding individually. We might be for some things, but not complex things, not complex knowledge. These decisions are taken by groups. So next we're going to look at a couple of elements which might affect that group decision. Where does that group decision come from? There are lots of things that could, but I'm just going to focus on two. The first is the subject matter. So sometimes that sets hard limits on the kinds of justification that we can have. What are we dealing with? What kind of data are we dealing with? What area are we working in? So we'll briefly look at that and see how that can form our standards, or at least greatly influence them. It's possible to have cultural differences even within that. The second element is our values, or what we're trying to achieve by the investigation. So that's why I've shifted from the term justification to the umbrella term epistemic standards. As we will sort of bring out, there are knowledge goals other than justifying our beliefs, and we'll look at that and how they might interact. But let's start with epistemic standards with subject matter. So the more straightforward way is it sets limits of the kind of justification that's possible within it. I've chosen academic subjects as examples here. It's the simplest thing for me to do, but I'll be really interested to see how these correspond to areas of expertise within the room in terms of their character. Mathematics, this is deductive reasoning. This is nice. This is the sort of highest form of justification you can get. Although it's important to note that the certainty here is limited to the relationships between the numbers, not the accuracy of the data that you put into the calculation. That's another thing. Mathematics is, sorry, it's gone a bit strange. Smaller and, yeah. Managing my notes, I apologise. You've got a high degree of certainty and a tiny area of scope. when you sort of go out of the strict dealing with the numbers themselves, your certainty level goes down, because then it's the accuracy of the data, and you're depending on empirical information, which is never as certain as how numbers relate to one another. So mathematics has got its own sort of smug glory going on of we're the best justification. Representing the sciences here, we have chemistry. Justified conclusions in chemistry relate to the scientific method. You put forward a hypothesis and you perform an experiment. And when we're evaluating how strong a claim in chemistry would be, we'll be thinking about things like, is this a falsifiable hypothesis? What counts as proving my hypothesis wrong? Right, so I have a hypothesis. Under what circumstances would I know this isn't true? And then I look for that. I'm actively trying to prove myself wrong. That's how sort of chemists will progress. Also, is this a repeatable experiment? If I do it again, am I going to get the same result? So these are standards which emerge from the nature of the activity, but also from the group doing it. You could imagine a version of chemistry which wasn't that interested in repeatability. It wouldn't be as good, but you can see that there is a social element to this. Decisions have been made that we will hold ourselves to these standards. But if the answer to both of these questions are no, I can't repeat the experiment, I can't falsify it, chemists will say, okay, no, not good enough, not justified in believing your conclusions. History. Yeah. So sciences have repeatability. History has corroboration, but it's not quite the same thing. If you have a variety of written sources about the same event, then yeah, you can be more certain about that event and the details of that event. You've got corroboration. But a lack of corroboration doesn't cast as much doubt on a historical claim as a lack of repeatability would on a claim in chemistry, because there are perfectly legitimate reasons why that might not happen. So, for example, if you want to estimate the population of England in 1086, you've got the Domesday Book and that's it. You don't have corroboration because you just don't. So historians have to proportion their standards to what they're working with. What can we do reasonably? What can we not do? And then you have archaeology, and this is where it gets weird, because archaeologists are doing history, but they don't have written sources. So they want to make the same sorts of claims that historians are making about what's happening at a given era in time, but they can't do it with written sources. So the epistemic standards that historians hold themselves to, archaeologists can't. They're much more likely to use chemistry, specifically biochemistry, carbon dating. But you can only carbon date things that were once alive. So suppose you find an object and it's partly made of wood and partly made of metal. You take it to your local friendly biochemist and you have them carbon date the wood. And they say, okay, well this tree died 2,500 years ago. They're like, okay, great, so the metal portion was made 2,500 years ago as well, so this must be a tool from the biochemist. No, hold on, wait a minute, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that. So the moment they move outside of, strictly speaking, what the chemist can tell them, they're no longer operating within the standards of chemistry. But they're not operating within the standards of history either. So effectively they have to invent their own standards. Otherwise, they have no standards and anything can get published, right? The reason archaeology is interesting is it's still a relatively young subject and it's still trying to do this. So you will have different schools of archaeology who hold themselves to different standards, and often they're moving between standards depending on what activity they're doing. Arguably, therefore, they're not a subject. There are several different subjects with different standards which are interacting. But you see the idea that the material you're working with does, to some degree, dictate your standards, but it's also a group decision and a cultural evaluation, a cultural development as well. So far, I've given examples of how expert groups develop epistemic standards in response to the subject matter they're dealing with. But there are other reasons why epistemic standards can develop, which are specific to particular groups. So this time let's think about a jury in a courtroom. When you're on a jury, you're listening to evidence, you are specifically asked whether the defendant is guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. So that's not the same question as, does the evidence point to the defendant being guilty? Or is the defendant probably guilty? You could well be in a situation where at a personal level you are convinced that the defendant is guilty, but aware that there is insufficient evidence to convict under this principle of reasonable doubt. And so you're obliged to find them innocent. Until relatively recently, Scottish courts reflected this reality by having 3 verdicts: guilty, and not proven, which means not guilty but don't do it again. So in the case of a courtroom, the epistemic standards of the group are impacted by the values of the group, what they're trying to achieve in the context. There's an ethical value that leads to an epistemic standard. It's more important that we don't convict innocent people than we do convict everyone who is guilty. That's a moral standard, and it's impacting the epistemic standard. That's our priority. So the takeaway from that is some errors matter more than others, depending on the context and your role within it. And you may have greater responsibility to avoid some errors than others. Interesting side note, there is an exception to the innocent until proven guilty rule in British libel law, or at least as it was until it was reformed, which is that if someone makes a defamatory statement about you in a public print or whatever, the statement is presumed false until proven true, which means that the defendant is presumed guilty until proven innocent. The whole thing reverses in British law, not in American law, which obliges the accuser to demonstrate willful lying or willful harm on the part of the defendant. That's a rabbit hole I could take you down, which I will avoid. But you see the idea of prioritising what you want to be sure you're not wrong about can affect where your standards go. Here's another interesting example. So, what affects our epistemic standards, our values, what we're trying to achieve? Have to talk about Wikipedia. So, Wikipedia, it was almost a joke for a while among academics of telling their students, never use this. This is terrible. This is not a decent source of information. You cannot learn things from Wikipedia. And it certainly does have shortcomings and epistemic vices. There's an article I'm using here called Wikipistemology, great title, by Don Fallis. And he says that somebody who reads Wikipedia, well, he doesn't say this, sorry, he's using a quote from The Economist, who themselves quoting Mr. McHenry, Britannica's former editor. So, somebody who reads Wikipedia is rather in the position of a visitor to a public restroom, says Mr. McHenry. It may be obviously dirty, so he knows to exercise great care, or it may seem fairly clean, so he may be lulled into a false sense of security. What he certainly does not know is who has used the facilities before him. One wonders whether people like Mr. McHenry would prefer there were no public lavatories at all. So what that sort of starts up is this idea that if you compare Wikipedia to a traditional encyclopedia, it doesn't match up to the standards traditional encyclopedias set themselves. It's also not setting itself those standards. So if you have a traditional encyclopedia, every entry will be written by an expert who were contacted specifically because they were an expert in that field. They then write that entry, the entries are collated and printed and published. There is no peer review system, by the way, for encyclopedia articles because they are too numerous. It would take too long. So they're just trusting an expert. The odd side effect of that is that if you side by side articles from a traditional encyclopedia on an area of expertise and Wikipedia article on the same thing, the Wikipedia article will have fewer errors than the mainstream encyclopedia article. However, all of the errors are ones which could be picked up by a layperson. So all the errors corrected are the ones that could be picked up by a layperson. So hidden in there will be errors that only an expert would pick up. Whereas in the encyclopedia article, there'll be errors that happen because you didn't have a proofreader. Right, the sort of citation errors or spelling mistakes, these sorts of errors. So it's not as simple as which has more errors, it's also which are more significant errors. But
surely there's a school of thought issue here. Who you select to be your writers or authors for the entries of an encyclopedia, and there are multiple schools of thought in all professions. So again, it comes back to the social choice.
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah, that's true. But the social choices with the encyclopedia compilers or traditional encyclopedia compilers is we get the best experts, and with them we trust them. That's how that works. And the vices of Wikipedia are, it's largely not written by experts, and it's harder to verify who wrote a particular thing than it is in the case of a traditional encyclopedia, where there's an author and you can see who they are and you can look up their qualifications. So those are the vices, but there are also virtues. So using the language of this article or references, there are other virtues we can consider. One is power. So how much knowledge can be acquired? There's a lot of information on Wikipedia that people wouldn't otherwise have access to. How fast? How quickly can you access this information? You don't have to buy a book or go to a library to attain it. You can do it so quickly that it's remarkably efficient, and you may end up gaining a lot of knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have looked at. And related to that is what they've called fecundity. So how many people can this reach? How many new ideas can it spark off? How many connections can we make? The argument with Wikipistemology is that there is a trade-off here. There is a conscious trade-off between guaranteeing accuracy at an expert level and providing these epistemic virtues. And Wikipedia knows that. They have their own goals and they are acting in accordance with those goals. If you want, that's Wikipedia, the developers of Wikipedia as a group. You as a group, if you're choosing whether or not to use Wikipedia, have to decide whether your goals are aligned with theirs in this particular instance. So if what you want is quick access to a surface level overview of a new concept, it's great. That's exactly what you want. It will give you a page. If you want in-depth expert detail, it can't offer you that. But importantly, it can point you towards other sources that can. And it is very obvious that it's not that. It's got an edit page, you can see that. It's got citations at the bottom, you can see that. And academics talking to their students now will have sort of veered from saying don't use Wikipedia to don't use Wikipedia as a citation. By all means, if you want to read over a topic very quickly, fine, but go to their citations and go to the citations and trace it like that, and then it's okay. So it's a counterbalance to those trade-offs. It says this is what we are, this is what we're good at, this is what our standards are. If you need something else, here are the places you can go. So that becomes important when we're thinking about evaluating standards. We can talk about evaluating yourself in terms of how well you have met your own epistemic standards. Also, you've evaluated John, we've talked about him, so we can talk about other groups, so other people within groups of which we're part, where we have membership of the same community, same organisation, same project, and you can reach alignment with them on certain common standards, and you can evaluate them if they don't meet those standards. Are they properly evaluating the evidence? But this works best if you have standards in common. What about if you are crossing boundaries between areas of expertise? If you're going somewhere where you don't really understand the standards or you don't understand the materials, when you're working with groups with different epistemic standards to what you're used to, different expertise, how do you know whether to believe them? In those circumstances, you may not be directly evaluating the evidence. Like if I'm not a biochemist, and I'm asking them to do carbon dating, like I can't evaluate their evidence on carbon dating because I don't understand it well enough. So in those circumstances, I'm not evaluating the evidence. I'm not evaluating whether I'm justified in believing the belief based on the evidence. I'm evaluating the group. What are the group like? Are they trustworthy? And that's where epistemology just goes very completely into the social element. This is most well established in philosophy of science. Helen Longino being expert in philosophy and sociology of science. So what she is interested in is how scientific research groups generate knowledge, how they interact with one another as individuals and as groups, as well as the experimentation process itself. And what she has developed is a set of standards which applies not to evaluating evidence, but to evaluating groups who would offer you a consensus. One element required, she says, for an epistemic group to be trustworthy, for you to be able to believe their consensus, is for them to have publicly recognised forums for the criticism of evidence, or of methods, of assumptions, of reasoning. So public might in some cases mean the newspaper reading public. If this was a political decision in a democracy, is this, have we been adequately informed of the processes involved? Is there a public criticism? But in specialist areas of knowledge, it might be conferences or peer-reviewed journals, or the scrutiny of one's colleagues in some semi-formalised way. But is there a forum where your evidence will be criticised? Is there an uptake of that criticism? So it's not just, is there any dissent? Will you hear dissent if it happens? Will you hear disagreement? It's, do beliefs and theories and approaches change over time in response when there is a criticism in place? Which, it doesn't mean it's going to happen in any particular given instance. It doesn't, not all criticism is valid. But if it never happens, you get suspicious. There is also...
Lisa, just a good question.
Please.
I'm just conscious of the thinking with the systems thinking practice hat on for a second.
Absolutely.
How much does this relate to trying to reconcile and make sense of different perspectives of something? Because obviously that's something we deal with all the time.
Absolutely.
I'm just conscious of whether that is something that plays into that.
I think this is absolutely the case. You can have... you can have groups who are even looking at the same evidence, who are operating under different epistemic standards, and literally it meets one set and not another. So I was on the fence whether to bring this in, but it might work well. There's a book by Peter Gallison called Image and Logic, which is about physics. Actually, it's about the sort of history of development of microphysics. And you have two groups who have basically been isolated from one another, but they're both experimenting to discover about the behaviour of subatomic particles. They're using different equipment. So with the image scientists, they're using bubble chambers. Bubble chambers are literally containers of liquid, and they produce bubbles when certain reactions in subatomic particles happen. You photograph these. And that's your evidence. So they're looking at the same kind of processes, but they're using different equipment to do it. And then Geiger-Müller counters can be used to gain evidence on similar things. What happened is these two groups started fighting for funding. As funding got more limited, and they were both trying to answer the same questions, and the authorities that were handing out this money were like, well, we can't fund both of you adequately. Who should we fund? And so we had the image scientists saying, look, insight is literal. If you can't see it, you don't understand it, we are providing knowledge of what's going on. And Geiger-Müller counters are just providing you with numbers. You don't understand it. It's not knowledge data, for sure, but it's not insight, it's not knowledge. On the fighting on the other side, for the image scientists, you have for the logic scientists, you have the point that, but you might be offering insight into an anomaly, because these take forever to set up. the amount of information you get from them is tiny compared to what a Geiger-Müller counter operation can do. You could be leading us right down the garden path and we wouldn't know. Knowledge needs a large quantity of data. We've got a large quantity of data. Fund us. So what we have there is different perspectives on what counts as evidence for the same thing, even though they agree on what is happening, even though they agree on what they're trying to achieve. But what happened that was fascinating is that once they had to articulate it, then they realized that there was a boundary between them, that they recognized where the boundary was. And when you've recognized that there's a boundary, then you can have meaningful crossing of that boundary, conscious crossing of that boundary. So whereas before you had a very strict division in these different departments of, one university had one approach and another had another, people started moving over for 6 months and doing it the other way and interacting, and 20 odd years of that and you've got a particle accelerator. What a particle accelerator does is to take a statistically significant number of images and average it. And there were exchange of ideas, explanations of why they had the values there were, and gradual change of material culture to create something that could match both sets of requirements. I don't think that's the end of the only positive end to a story like that. Just the fact that they have articulated that they are trying to do slightly different things can be helpful in itself. But it's a fun one, so,
Lisa, can I ask?
Yeah.
So these 4 things, have they come about from Helen going, this is what I think it should be, or is this what it actually evidentially is?
It is slightly ambiguous.
Okay.
This is a result of Helen Longino looking at a lot of groups, arriving at common good behaviours which seem to make them thrive and be productive, but there is certainly an element of ought about it. Okay. This should result in more reliably true beliefs. But as we said, fallibility, a group could do all of this and still end up going down the wrong path. But it is based on Helen Longino's understanding of real scientific research groups and what they do.
Okay, thanks.
She tried to create a kind of set of kite marks for quality of different domains of expertise. So, for example, comparing the quality of the outputs of physics with the quality of the outputs of economics, which apparently, as far as I can make out, is just ideological stuff. Really hopeless.
Oh, economics, that's interesting.
Are we allowed to do such things?
She has not, and
We should be able to.
Should do.
Oh, I could bring through. Part of the reason I have to say, and sort of getting meta and going to some thinking on this, there is little reward for her in doing so. She has no, I know, but this is the thing. This is sort of part of why I'm hoping this interaction could be interesting. There is very little reward in academic research into knowledge groups for specifying this in ways which would go outside of academia. So I think the answer is she hasn't, partly because she wouldn't have the funding to do it. With economics, there's a different, that is not, I think, close enough to natural science for this, for Helen Longino to directly address it. But I think part of the question here is how much could we take this and put it somewhere else? Because remember, this is not actually saying anything about what the standards ought to be. It's saying that they should be public. And it might be that they're public standards and they vary hugely. Like Wikipedia standards, they're public. You know what you're getting, right? If you want something else, don't use them. But the fact that they're public enables you to do that. And the fact that they are articulated means that people within the group can, measure whether or not they're reaching those standards. So, they might be thinking about comprehensivity of, that's not a word, but you know what I mean. What articles are missing? What do we not have anyone writing on? Is much more important to them than do we have the best experts. So they can evaluate themselves on their own standards. The problem, perhaps, with economics is, can you write them down? Like, is there a set of standards that is public? So it's not that their standards are terrible, because we only establish that once we know what they are. If the problem is they don't have a set of standards, that's a different problem. Yeah. So
somebody told me once that economics is not a theory of how economies work, it's a theory of what would have to be true for markets to optimally distribute resources. Right. So it's a hypothesis rather than a scientific theory in that sense.
Right. I mean,
the centre of economics is the hypothesis that human beings are like Homo economicus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there's, you know, I'm getting back into falsifiability.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's a good thing. If it were claiming to be a science, then, you know, there's a sort of test as to whether it comes under the boundary of science, which is sort of suggested by Karl Popper, which is it falsifiable? But also, has it been falsified and shifted the goalposts? So that's that thing where I described, where, you know, you continue to believe it anyway. You don't believe the change anyway. He accuses Marxism of that. So he says that once Marxism was a science, because it predicted the uprising of the working class, and it predicted it within a time frame. That time frame passed and it didn't happen. That means it's been
written down the road.
Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. So at that point,
we were revolting, but we didn't actually revolt. So.
This is the problem. But because this did not happen at this point, it's like, okay, you had a hypothesis. This is what would falsify your hypothesis. It's been falsified. You're carrying on with it anyway. You're not doing science anymore.
Sounds like other schools of economics, aren't they?
Yeah.
Or doomsday theory.
But yeah, the question is whether it ought to be a science, though. Because
it thinks it's a science, doesn't it?
yes, it does think it's a science, and that's the issue. So archaeology cannot do this. It knows it can't do this. It's doing its best to come up with decent standards, so they're not just doing any nonsense. But if it tried to be a science, it would be very bad at it, and that actually happened in the 70s. They were trying to be a science. They were claiming that, you know, the biochemical results were archaeological results, but they're kind of not. So part of having good science is trying to figure out whether or not something actually belongs as a science or not. And if it doesn't, it needs its own set of standards, and you need to articulate what those are. So it could, you know, an alternative way of framing, sort of looking at subjects which are failing to be a science is, well, are they just not a science? And in which case, what standards should they be holding themselves to, and are they meeting those? So yeah, publicly recognised standards. Can you articulate them? Can you say what they are? Can you judge yourself by them? Can you explain them to someone outside? Which is sort of part of it. Final element: equality of intellectual authority. Now, this needs a bit of explaining, because she's not saying everyone in a group knows just as much as everybody else and should be taken just as seriously. Obviously, you know, experience and expertise matters and is relevant. What she's saying is that what consensus exists must ideally, let's put in ideally, be the result of not of the exercise of political or economic power or the exclusion of dissenting perspectives. So if this needn't be as dramatic as you cannot disagree with us, we have our ways, and it can be something, you can fall short of this by something as simple as not rewarding dissensus. So if, for example, relatively weak evidence for a politically popular conclusion is given more weight than it deserves, held to a lower set of standards than you would evidence for a less popular conclusion. Or if you have younger, less experienced people who are reluctant to defend anything but the most compelling results, because if they're remotely unpopular, then they don't want to put them forward, then you need to correct for that by actively encouraging them to do so and rewarding them for doing so. So a positive requirement to encourage dissenting voices. This doesn't mean every dissenting voice is treated as correct. It doesn't mean that every bit of dissent results in a change, and it doesn't mean that you don't value experience. But if there is a situation where if something is politically unpopular, it never happens. If there's a situation where consensus does not arise in an intellectual manner, then it falls short of this ideal. Now, this is obviously developed in the context of academic communities, which the entire purpose of academic communities in this context is to produce knowledge. That's what they're for, which changes the energy somewhat. Making a politically informed decision if you're doing politics is different to if you're doing science. But I put it forward anyway because it is definitely something that can be present to a greater or lesser extent in different groups, and it's something that Longino evaluates groups in reference to. What's interesting to think about in terms of Wikipedia, which we've just been talking about, is it's actually relatively good at meeting these standards, albeit that the public standards that it puts out there may not be ones you want to enter into if you're doing a serious piece of academic research. ChatGPT, however, terrible.
The C word,
Yes, no, but seriously, there is. I cannot trace back where they got this information from. So the boundaries that are set by Wikipedia of these are our standards. This is what we do. This is what we can't do. Here's where you go if you can't, if you need something else. All of that framing is missing. The process of if you flip onto the edit pages on Wikipedia, you'll see why the information is there. Why the information on the main page is there, what disputes have been held over it, how many times has it been edited, who has been editing this, is there a little infight that's been going on. You'll see all of that. So you see the mess, you see the standards, you see, whereas with ChatGPT it's all invisible. It's behind a wall. So I am actually much more worried about changes in epistemic habits as a result of ChatGPT than I would ever be with Wikipedia. Wikipedia knows what it's doing.
Yeah, my question, I was thinking exactly that just before, that if the epistemology terms are being reassessed, or the knowledge as technology advances, because obviously we have this extensive vast information, but we had very few sources before, which now you don't know where it's coming from.
It's a huge shift.
Which results in having more assumptions that we are not aware of. And if you are not careful when you are trying to do a process and thinking, actually, you recognize this one has been a bias and has been an assumption.
Yes.
There will be a point in time which we are not going to be able to. Is the academia moving? Obviously, it's moving slower than what technology is producing. So are we going to be
it's
kind of lost in information, which we are going to become
agnotologists? Yeah, there's a reason it's emerging now. If you look at epistemology from centuries ago, it's all about how can we increase our store of knowledge, how can we get more information, and the knowledgeable people are the ones who are the well-read people who have the most information coming in. That's no longer true. Multiplying the amount of information you have coming in does not make you know more anymore. What you now need are filters, and good filters. And how do you avoid misinformation? How do you protect yourself? How do you? So I think that in terms of the study of knowledge systems and how they work, that's why agnotology is coming out now. That's why epistemology is much more focused on the social element. It used to be much more individualistic and what you can do to make sure your beliefs are correct. But academia itself, more broadly, catching up, that's tricky. It's not going to be fast. I am extremely grateful not to be marking essays this year. okay, so
can I just comment about this?
Yeah.
Some of these criteria as requirements, because I'm sort of like, playing and telling people about critical systems heuristics at the moment. I'm just really conscious that actually Ulrich's method at the moment doesn't really question. It asks about, who are knowledgeable people, what knowledge that they bring to the operation of a system, and then we're sort of guarantors of some of that. But it doesn't ever really question these updates of, can the knowledge be criticised?
Yeah.
Can it be contradicted? What's the different? It doesn't question the balance of power of knowledge within those who operate the system. Interestingly, there is a really nice link between the thing about the exclusion of dissenting perspectives, because in CSH you have this idea of legitimacy, the people to whom the system is done.
Right,
Who may dissent. So there's a nice linkage between that. But within the people who own the thing, there really isn't a questioning in his method about what knowledge really means and where it came from.
That's
and
interesting.
How it can be challenged. And so if this is a nice overlay, I could actually think about how to apply some of this idea. You should question the knowledge and how it arrived.
But I think as well, Tony, this applies to the field as a whole. We've been, generally speaking, as a field, we've been pants at evidencing.
You are remarkably young. I said archaeology is young.
Really.
Well, I'm talking about archaeology as being young, and it's 200 years old for a standard of young. Right? So if you're measuring in decades, then that's young.
Yeah. But we had a meeting in this room where Michael Fifner was doing his PhD research, talking about his PhD research. It wasn't actually here, it was across the road, wasn't it? Where he used VSM on he'd assessed 138 organisations using VSM, and he got the evidence of, does it actually do what it says on the tin?
Right,
make the organisation more viable? To which the answer is yes, to I can't remember the number, 71% correlation between VSM and but that's vanishingly rare in the field as evidence. It's fantastic, but
So the evolution of systems thinking as a subject does involve a movement towards publicly recognisable standards. And that doesn't mean to say that there aren't a lot of good practices going on. Without that, it can, but there are a lot of good practices going on in archaeology, and it's because they're still kind of piecemeal. And that's okay, so long as they know that they are, and they're holding themselves to the individual standards in different areas for good reasons, then it evolves. But yeah, it's a goal. It is potentially a goal. One idea that might connect to what you were saying before, I don't know if it's useful or not, but some social epistemologists will talk about groups knowing things as more than a metaphor. Like it's not that you have a justified true belief belonging to a bunch of people who are in a group. It's that the justification is at the group level. So the group knows something, even if individuals within it do not. And so there's things about sort of aggregate judgment and such to explore with that.
Back to this afternoon.
Yeah.
Talk about criticism.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay. So all of this so far was about knowledge. I'm briefly going to talk about ignorance. So cultural production of ignorance. So you've got.
The politest way I've seen it phrased.
So agnotology, same root as agnostic, is theory of ignorance. It's something you can't know or something you don't know. But it's not focused on unknowable things, deep, dark mysteries. It's produced ignorance. So the most obvious example of this is censorship. I have a book by this title, Agnotology. There's an article in it by Peter Gallison, again, keeps cropping up. Has this little example in it, which I find fascinating. In 2001, the entire system of Harvard libraries acquired 60 million new pages of knowledge, new books, etc. In the same year, the US government classified 330 million pages. So that is 5 times as much culturally produced ignorance as culturally produced knowledge, according to Callison. There's a lot more classified information than I was aware. But that's one example. So in that case, certain truths are kept away from people. Another way we can be kept ignorant, though, is via manufactured uncertainty. The classic example used in the text about this is the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry couldn't censor information regarding the link between smoking and lung cancer, but they could disseminate a whole bunch of misinformation which muddied the water and made the link seem to be far more scientifically doubtful than it actually was. So there was the potential for the public to know this, but evaluating evidence means evaluating all the evidence that's coming at you. You are not in a position to identify misinformation in the same way that an expert is, and so by the use of misinformation.
So this is currently happening with climate science, would we argue?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's the second example.
That came out, the extent to which they're climate modelling, surprisingly accurate.
Conspiratorial, isn't it?
Exactly that. So you can see that these default examples are ones in which ignorance is either obviously bad or at least morally grey. It's like, what are they keeping from us? But agnotologists aren't saying that all ignorance is bad. Sometimes it's neutral. Sometimes you want it. So why would you choose ignorance? First, inquiry is always selective. You can't pay attention to everything. You've got to choose what you regard as most relevant. And pay attention to that, and in doing that you're not paying attention to something else. I had a look at Thinking in Systems by Donella H. Meadows. I found her diagrams quite interesting in this, because she uses clouds in her diagrams to represent elements of the system that we aren't going to look at right now, and gives reasons why we're not going to look at it right now, to say okay, this isn't relevant because, and then doesn't pay attention to them afterwards. This would be paradoxically well-informed ignorance. So we're not going to pay attention to it because it's not relevant, and we know it's not relevant because. That's quite a rare position to be in, actually, to be able to definitively say, I don't need to know that, because unexpected connections always come up. But it's an interesting question as to how we make an informed decision about what to exclude from our inquiries, and I suppose that's connected to what assumptions we're going to make in our inquiries. A couple of plausible tools. You might justify a deliberate exclusion by generalising from other cases where you investigated this area and it had no bearing on it at all, so you're not going to do it again. Or you could mitigate it by having good relationships with people who work in another department who will give you a heads up if anything's really going to impact you, and otherwise you assume that it's not. This sort of thing. These are essentially boundaries to your work that you're setting. You have to do this. But regardless, you will choose to remain ignorant of certain things because you've got to focus on other things. This is fine, this is neutral. Secondly, why would we choose ignorance? Some information is sensitive. So it could be GDPR. This is clearly a case of culturally produced ignorance. Article 17, people have the right to be forgotten, right? Literally the right for other people to be ignorant of certain information about them. There might also be information within a company, obviously. This is why we have the colour coding system even in this room, which it's necessary to keep private. Both of those examples are trade-offs. You're sort of balancing knowledge concerns against other concerns. You know, you want to have information, but people need privacy, you get a balance. You want to have information, but you've only got limited time, you figure out a balance. But there is one example I'd really be interested to explore with you, where knowledge of one thing might depend on ignorance of something else. And this is just a conversation I had, which deeply but specific. So I was talking to a systems engineer who works for a train company. And I was sort of exploring some of these ideas and talking about epistemology and the process of designing a bridge. My thought was to explore the differences you might have between engineering and mathematics. I was sort of trying to figure out that page earlier where I had the different subjects. And my thought was, suppose there was a maths exam, 5 minutes, sure, that's absolutely fine. A maths exam where the question was asked, how much weight can this bridge take? And you were given the statistics on the materials and the shape and all of that. And you could have someone who's basically doing applied mathematics answer that question in an exam. And I thought, well, an engineer would surely not answer it the same way because they would be concerned about adding safety margins in. So the way I framed the question was, like presumably you calculate the capacity based on the materials and structure, just as the maths student would, but once you have that number, you would add a safety margin. He visibly flinched at the question. His answer was, that number does not exist. And I blinked at this. I said, what do you mean it doesn't exist? How do you add the safety margin if you haven't got the baseline number in place first? And he said, well, the number doesn't exist because you add margins before you calculate. You add a margin to the weight of the train. You add to the weight of the train. You assume maximum capacity. You overestimate the weight of everybody who's on the train in the maximum capacity. You assume everyone is jostling and moving around and affecting the balance. You assume that the materials are 20% weaker than advertised. You assume tiny flaws in the construction that might weaken the bridge by another 20%. Then you calculate. Then you add a 30% margin on top of that, and that's the internal number, to which you add a margin before you send it to the client. Because that way, you know that people aren't going to die. So the question, can the bridge take this weight, asked to an engineer is, like, would you send this out? Would you risk this, effectively? Having the number in your head of what the breaking point of the bridge is contrary to knowing that the bridge is safe, right? If you have that number in your head, you see how different it is from all the margins of safety you've added on top, you start to doubt that procedure of adding those margins. You start to think, oh, it's not that bad. We could let the client get away with investing less in this. And it just incrementally might creep down and down and down. So the engineer, wanting to be sure that the bridge can take the weight of the train and the passengers, cannot know what that number is. That number does not exist. I find this remarkably striking because partly this is, I want to know A, so I cannot know B, which is a fascinating sort of example. But also it's a different question being asked. Because the mathematician, when asked how much weight can this bridge take, is answering what's the breaking point. The engineer hears the same question and says, is this, at what point is this safe? So when you ask the same question to people with different sets of values, different sets of standards, they won't hear the same question and they won't answer the same question. So even though they're both telling you the truth, they will contradict each other. So yeah, that's it, that's me. I would be really fascinated to see if any of this sort of lands and is applicable in different areas. And yeah, now you can have coffee. That's all.
Thank you so much.